Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more freedom. Today we are continuing our journey in our energetic investment into exploring the founding documents of the United States. We are going to be dealing with Federalist Papers 21, 22, and 23 today, and dealing specifically with why smaller confederations are not the optimal answer. It actually comes in a perfect timing because I got a comment yesterday by a guy who I highly respect, uh, saying that maybe it is time that we break apart and that we go into smaller unions. But this is like perfectly timed to argue against that. So we are going to read the thoughts of Alexander Hamilton and some of the other founding fathers on the defects of the present Confederation. If you were unaware, we almost did not have a union. We almost were smaller confederations. If you haven't been going through the rest of them, and I don't blame you if you haven't, they have talked several times about how they were leaning towards smaller confederations and why they thought that it was a bad idea. But today we're going to get more into the specifics of that. Let's read into Federalist number 21. This is for the Independent Journal by Alexander Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. Having, in the last three numbers, taken a summary review of the principal circumstances and events which have depicted the genius and fate of other Confederate governments, I shall now proceed in the enumeration of the most important of those defects which have hitherto disappointed our hopes from the system established among ourselves. To form a safe and satisfactory judgment of the proper remedy, it is absolutely necessary that we should be well acquainted with the extent and malignity of the disease. The next most palpable defect of the subsisting confederation is the total want of a sanction to its laws. The United States, as now composed, have no powers to exact obedience or punish disobedience to their resolutions, either by pecuniary mulcts or by a suspension or divestiture of privileges, or by any other constitutional mode. There is no express delegation of authority to them to use force against delinquent members, and if such a right should be ascribed to the federal head as resulting from the nature of the social compact between the states, it must be by inference and construction, in the face of that part of the second article by which it is declared that each state shall retain every power, jurisdiction, and right not expressly delegated to the United States and Congress assembled. There is, doubtless, a striking absurdity in supposing that a right of this kind does not exist, but we are reduced to the dilemma of either embracing that supposition, preposterous as it may seem, or of contravening or explaining away a provision which has of late been a repeated theme of the eulogies of those who oppose the new Constitution, and the want of which, in that plan, has been the subject of much plausible animadversion and severe criticism. If we are unwilling to impair the force of this applauded provision, we shall be obliged to conclude that the United States afford the extraordinary spectacle of a government destitute even of a shadow of constitutional power to enforce the execution of its own laws. It will appear from the specimens which have been cited that the American Confederacy, in this particular, stands discriminated from every other institution of a similar kind and exhibits a new and unexampled phenomena in the political world. The want of a mutual guarantee of the state governments is another capital imperfection in the federal plan. There is nothing of this kind declared in the articles that compose it, and to imply a tacit guarantee from considerations of utility would be a still more flagrant departure from the clause which has been mentioned than to imply a tacit power of coercion from the like considerations. The want of a guarantee, though it might in its consequences endanger the Union, does not so immediately attack its existence as the want of a constitutional sanction to its laws. Without a guarantee, the assistance to be derived from the Union in repelling those domestic dangers which may sometimes threaten the existence of the state constitutions must be renounced. Usurpation may rear its crest in each state and trample upon the liberties of the people. while the national government could legally do nothing more than behold its encroachments with indignation and regret. A successful faction may erect a tyranny on the ruins of order and law, while no succor could constitutionally be afforded by the Union to the friends and supporters of the government. The tempestuous situation from which Massachusetts has scarcely emerged evinces that dangers of this kind are not merely speculative. Who can determine what might have been the issue of her late convulsions if the malcontents had been headed by a Caesar or a Cromwell? Who can predict what effect a despotism established in Massachusetts would have upon the liberties of New Hampshire or Rhode Island or Connecticut or New York? The inordinate pride of state importance has suggested to some minds an objection to the principles of a guarantee in the federal government, as involving an officious interference in the domestic concerns of the members. A scruple of this kind would deprive us of one of the principal advantages to be expected from union, and can only flow from a misapprehension of the nature of the provision itself. It could be no impediment to reforms of the state constitution by a majority of the people in a legal and peaceable mode. This right would remain undiminished. The guarantee could only operate against changes to be effected by violence. Towards the prevention of calamities of this kind, too many checks cannot be provided. The peace of society and the stability of government depend absolutely on the efficacy of precautions adopted on this head. Where the whole power of the government is in the hands of the people, there is less pretense for the use of violent remedies in partial or occasional distempers of the state. The natural cure for an ill administration in a popular or representative constitution is a change of men. A guarantee by the national authority would be as much leveled against the usurpations of rulers as against the ferments and outrages of faction and sedition in the community. The principle of regulating the contributions of the states to the common treasury by quotas is another fundamental error in the Confederation. Its repugnancy to an adequate supply of the national exigencies has been already pointed out and has sufficiently appeared from the trial which has been made of it. I speak of it now solely with a view to equality among the states. Those who have been accustomed to contemplate the circumstances which produce and constitute national wealth must be satisfied that there is no common standard or barometer by which the degrees of it can be ascertained. Neither the value of lands nor the numbers of the people, which have successively proposed as the rule of state contributions, has any pretension to being a just representative. If we compare the wealth of the United Netherlands with that of Russia or Germany, or even of France, and if we at the same time compare the total value of the lands and the aggregate populations of that contracted district with the total value of the lands and the aggregate population of the immense regions of either of the three last mentioned countries, we shall at once discover that there is no comparison between the proportion of either of these two objects and that of the relative wealth of the nations. If the like parallel were to run between several of the American states, it would furnish a like result. Let Virginia be contrasted with North Carolina, Pennsylvania with Connecticut, or Maryland with New Jersey, and we shall be convinced that the respective abilities of those states, in relation to revenue, bear little or no analogy to their comparative stock in lands or to their comparative population. The position may be equally illustrated by a similar process between the counties of the same state. No man who is acquainted with the state of New York would doubt that the active wealth of Kings County bears a much greater proportion to that of Montgomery than it would appear to be if we would take either the total value of the lands or the total number of peoples as a criterion. The wealth of nations depends upon an infinite variety of causes: situation, soil, climate, the nature of the productions, the nature of the government, the genius of its citizens, the degree of information they possess, the state of commerce, the arts, of industry. These circumstances and many more, too complex, minute, or advantageous to admit of a particular specification, occasion differences hardly conceivable in the relative opulence and riches of different countries. The consequences clearly is that there can be no common measure of national wealth, and Of course, no general or stationary rule by which the ability of a state to pay taxes can be determined. The attempt, therefore, to regulate the contributions of the members of a confederacy by any such rule cannot fail to be productive of glaring inequality and extreme oppression. This inequality would of itself be sufficient in America to work the eventual destruction of the Union, if any mode of enforcing a compliance with its requisitions could be devised. The suffering states would not long consent to remain associated upon a principle which distributes the public burdens with so unequal a hand, and which was calculated to impoverish and oppress the citizens of some states, while those of others would scarcely be conscious of the small proportion of the weight they were required to sustain. This, however, is an evil inseparable from the principle of quotas and requisitions. There is no method of steering clear of this inconvenience but by authorizing the national government to raise its own revenues in its own ways. Imposed excises, and in general all duties upon articles of consumption may be compared to a fluid, which will, in time, find its level with the means of paying them. The amount to be contributed by each citizen will in a degree be at his own option, and can be regulated by an attention to his resources. The rich may be extravagant, the poor can be frugal, and private oppression may always be avoided by a judicious selection of objects proper for such impositions. If inequalities should arise in some states from duties on particular objects, these will, in all probability, be counterbalanced by proportional inequalities in other states from the duties on other objects. In the course of time and things, an equilibrium, as far as it is attainable in so complicated a subject, will be established everywhere. Or, if inequalities should still exist, they would neither be so great in their degree, so uniform in their operation, nor so odious in their appearance, as those which would necessarily spring from quotas upon any scale that can possibly be devised. It is the signal advantage of taxes on articles of consumption that they contain in their own nature a security against excess. They prescribe their own limit, which cannot be exceeded without defeating the end proposed, that is, an extension of the revenue. When applied to this object, the saying is just as it is witty, that in political arithmetic 2 and 2 do not always make 4. If duties are too high, they lessen the consumption, the collection is eluded, and the product to the treasury is not so great as when they are confined within proper and moderate bounds. This forms a complete barrier against any material oppression of the citizen by taxes of this class, and is itself a natural limitation of the power of imposing them. Impositions of this kind usually fall under the denomination of indirect taxes, and must for a long time constitute the chief part of the revenue raised in this country. Those of the direct kind, which principally relate to land and building, may admit of a rule of apportionment. Either the value of land or the number of the people may serve as a standard. The state of agriculture and the populousness of a country have been considered as nearly connected with each other, and as a rule, for the purpose intended, numbers, in the view of simplicity and certainty, are entitled to a preference. In every country it is a Herculean task to obtain a valuation of the land. In a country imperfectly settled and progressive in improvement, the difficulties are increased almost to impracticability. The expense of an accurate valuation is, in all situations, a formidable objection. In a branch of taxation where no limits to the discretion of the government are to be found in the nature of things, the establishment of a fixed rule, not incompatible with the end, may be attended with fewer inconveniences than to leave that discretion together at large. And so ends Federalist 21. And what do we learn here? We learn that if you are dealing with a confederation of states, then you're going to have a variability of enforcement of laws. You're going to have a variability of what the tax rates are, what the duties and excises between the states are going to be, and there will be no cooperation between them. There won't. If you look at, for instance, Just take Colorado. And let's go ahead and give Colorado blue, right? Because Denver is the most populous city, and Denver is highly blue, even though most of the rest of the state is red. So the state goes blue, and they secede from the Union. Let's give them the grace of that. And they secede from the Union, and they decide that they're going to impose their own taxes. They're going to impose their own excise duties. They're going to impose their own problems. Then there is no recourse to that, right? If you need something from Colorado, then you're going to have to pay that. But the problem isn't that. The problem is the other confederation, because the surrounding states, right? And the reason I use Colorado in specificity is because of the surrounding states, right? You got Oklahoma and all these states around that are very much red. What do you think is going to happen to Colorado in that instance? Do you think that they're going to form an alliance with California? Probably so, but they still have to get there. They still have to communicate between there. They have to go through Arizona and New Mexico. Well, they're red for the most part. They're heavily blue parts, and maybe they go blue. But the problem is the cooperation between the states, because if you are diametrically opposed to the things happening in Colorado, then you're not going to deal with Colorado. And guess what? Colorado can't ship downriver, right? We can decide that if we are the red ones, we can just decide, no, you don't get to ship down our rivers. That was the problem here. That was the problem before we had this. That will be a problem again if there is a sovereign country of Colorado. They're not going to be able to ship anything out. They'll be able to fly, but they can't drive through our roads. We're not going to let them. Why would we? You left our union. Why would we agree to cooperate with you? That's silly. That's against our own interest. Our interest is the union. And in my opinion, we would be better off if there were more in the union than there are now. If we expanded beyond our current bounds, we would probably be better off if we were, and not in a you must join us type of way, but in a whoever wants to join us type of way, we would be better off, because these issues disappear. The cooperation issues disappear. The difference in excise and variability, all of that disappears if everybody is working towards the same goals for the same union. And that is, in large part, why we can't really dissolve. What are we going to have? The Union of New York and the Union of California and Seattle? But what happens if you have the Union of the southern states, which are almost exclusively red? Well, that would be a big problem, because we control most of the shipping. The Mississippi River right here where I live controls most of the shipping. And if you have declared yourself an enemy of us by deciding that you don't want to be part of our union, then we don't let your ships come down my river. That's a problem. That's a problem for anyone upriver who wants things. Yes, you can bring them in by airplane, but that is extremely expensive, and that would be the only way, because I'm not letting you use my roads either. Do you see the problem with the dissolution? That is the problem with the dissolution. All right, let's dive back into the text. Federalist number 22, the same subject continued. The New York Packet, December 14th, 1787. Alexander Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. In addition to the defects already enumerated in the existing federal system, there are others of not less importance, which concur in rendering it altogether unfit for the administration of the affairs of the Union. The want of a power to regulate commerce is by all parties allowed to be of the number. The utility of such a power has been anticipated under the first head of our inquiries, and for this reason, as well as from the universal conviction entertained upon the subject, little need be added in this place. It is, indeed, evident on the most superficial view that there is no object, either as it respects the interest of trade or finance, that more strongly demands a federal superintendence. The want of it has already operated as a bar to the formation of beneficial treaties with foreign powers, and has given occasions of dissatisfaction between the states. No nation acquainted with the nature of our political association would be unwise enough to enter into stipulations with the United States by which they conceded privileges of any importance to them, while they were apprised that the engagements on the part of the Union might at any moment be violated by its members, and while they found from experience that they might enjoy every advantage they desired in our markets without granting us any return, but such as their momentary convenience might suggest. It is not, therefore, to be wondered at that Mr. Jenkinson, in ushering into the House of Commons a bill for regulating the temporary intercourse between the two countries, should preface its introduction by a declaration that similar provisions in former bills had been found to answer every purpose in the commerce of Great Britain, and that it would be prudent to persist in the plan until it should appear whether the American government was likely or not to acquire greater consistency. Several states have endeavored, by separate prohibitions, restrictions, and exclusions, to influence the conduct of that kingdom in this particular. But the want of concert, arising from the want of a general authority and from clashing and dissimilar views in the state, has hitherto frustrated every experiment of the kind, and will continue to do so as long as the same obstacles to a uniformity of measures continue to exist. The interfering and unneighborly regulations of some states, contrary to the true spirit of the Union, have, in different instances, given just cause of umbrage and complaint to others. And it is to be feared that examples of this nature, if not restrained by a national control, would be multiplied and extended till they became not less serious sources of animosity and discord than injurious impediments to the intercourse between the different parts of the Confederacy. The commerce of the German Empire is in continual trammels from the multiplicity of the duties which the several princes and states exact upon the merchandises passing through their territories, and by means of which the fine streams and navigable waters with which Germany is so happily watered are rendered almost useless. Though the genius of the people in this country might never permit this description to be strictly applicable to us, yet we may reasonably expect, from the gradual conflicts of state regulations, that the citizens of each would at length come to be considered and treated by the others in no better light than that of the foreigners and aliens. The power of raising armies, by the most obvious construction of the Articles of the Confederation, is merely a power of making requisitions upon states for quotas of men. This practice, in the course of the late war, was found replete with obstructions to a vigorous and to an economical system of defense. It gave birth to a competition between the states, which created a kind of auction for men. In order to furnish the quotas required of them, they outbid each other until bounties grew to an enormous and insupportable size. The hope of a still further increase afforded an inducement to those who were disposed to serve to procrastinate their enlistment, and discipline them from engaging for any considerable periods. Hence, slow and scanty levies of men in the most critical emergencies of our affairs, short enlistments at an unparalleled expense, continual fluctuations in the troops, ruinous to their discipline and subjecting the public safety frequently to the perilous crisis of a disbanded army. Hence, also, those oppressive expedients for raising men which were upon several occasions practiced, and which nothing but enthusiasm of liberty would have induced the people to endure. This method of raising troops is not more unfriendly to economy and vigor than it is to equal distribution of the burden. The states near the seat of war, influenced by motives of self-preservation, made efforts to furnish their quotas, which even exceeded their abilities, while those at a distance from danger were, for the most part, as remiss as the others were diligent in their exertions. The immediate pressure of this inequality was not in this case, as in that of the contributions of money, alleviated by the hope of a final liquidation. The states which did not pay their proportions of money might at least be charged with their deficiencies, but no account could be formed of the deficiencies in the supplies of men. We shall not, however, see much reason to regret the want of this hope when we consider how little the prospect there is that the most delinquent states will ever be able to make compensation for their pecuniary failures. The system of quotas and requisitions, whether it be applied to men or money, is in every view a system of imbecility in the Union, and of inequality and injustice among the members. The right of equal suffrage among the states is another exceptional part of the Confederation. Every idea of proportion and every rule of fair representation conspire to condemn a principle, which gives to Rhode Island an equal weight in the scale of power with Massachusetts or Connecticut or New York, and to Delaware an equal voice in the national deliberations with Pennsylvania or Virginia or North Carolina. Its operation contradicts the fundamental maxim of a republican government, which requires that the sense of the majority should prevail. Sophistry may reply that sovereigns are equal and that a majority of the votes of the states will be a majority of Confederate America. But this kind of logical legerdemain will never counteract the plain suggestions of justice and common sense. It may happen that this majority of states is a small minority of the people of America, and two-thirds of the people of America could not long be persuaded, upon the credit of artificial distinctions and syllogistic subtleties, to submit their interests to the management and disposal of one-third. The larger states would, after a while, revolt from the idea of receiving the law from the smaller. To acquiesce in such privation of their due importance in the political scale would not merely be insensible to the love of power, but even to sacrifice the desire of equality. It is neither rational to expect the first, nor just to require the last. The smaller states, considering how peculiarly their safety and welfare depended upon union, ought readily to renounce a pretension which, if not relinquished, would prove fatal to its duration. It may be objected to this that not 7 but 9 states, or two-thirds of the whole number, must consent to the most important resolutions, and it may be thence inferred that 9 states would always comprehend a majority of the Union. But this does not obviate the impropriety of an equal vote between states of the most unequal dimensions and populousness, nor is the inference accurate in this point of fact, for we can enumerate 9 states which contain less than a majority of the people, and it is constitutionally possible that these 9 may give the vote. Besides, there are matters of considerable moment determinable by a bare majority, and there are others, concerns which doubts have been entertained, which, if interpreted in the favor of sufficiency of a vote of 7 states, would extend its operation to interest of the first magnitude. In addition to this, it is to be observed that there is a probability of an increase in the number of states, and no provision for a proportional augmentation of the ratio of votes. But this is not all. What at first sight may seem to be a remedy is in reality a poison. To give a minority a negative upon the majority, which is always the case where more than a majority is requisite to a decision, is, in its tendency, to subject the sense of the greater number to that of the lesser. Congress, from the non-attendance of a few states, have been frequently in the situation of a Polish Diet, where a single vote has been sufficient to put a stop to all their movements. A 60th part of the Union, which is about the proportion of Delaware and Rhode Island, has several times been able to oppose an entire bar to its operations. This is one of those refinements which, in practice, has an effect the reverse of what is expected from it in theory. The necessity of unanimity in public bodies, or something approaching towards it, has been founded upon a supposition that it would contribute to security. But its real operation is to embarrass the administration, to destroy the energy of the government, and to substitute the pleasure, caprice, or artifices of an insignificant, turbulent, or corrupt junto to the regular deliberations and decisions of a respectable majority. In those emergencies of a nation in which the goodness or badness, the weakness or strength of its government is of the greatest importance, there is commonly a necessity for action. The public business must, in some way or other, go forward. If a pertinacious minority can control the opinion of a majority respecting the best mode of conducting it, the majority, in order that something may be done, must conform to the views of the minority, and thus the sense of the smaller number will overrule that of the greater and give it a tone to the national proceedings. Hence, Tedious delays, continual negotiation and intrigue, contemptible compromises to the public good. And yet, in such a system, it is even happy when such compromises can take place. For upon some occasions, things will not admit of accommodation. And then, the measures of the government must be injuriously suspended or fatally defeated. It is often, by the impracticability of obtaining the concurrence of the necessary number of votes, kept a state of inaction. Its situation must always savor of weakness, sometimes border upon anarchy. It is not difficult to discover that a principle of this kind gives greater scope to foreign corruption, as well as to domestic faction, than that which permits the sense of the majority to decide. Though the contrary of this has been presumed, the mistake has proceeded from not attending with due care to the mischiefs that may be occasioned by obstructing the progress of government at certain critical seasons. When the concurrence of a large number is required by the Constitution to the doing of any national act, we are apt to rest satisfied that all is safe, because nothing improper will be likely to be done. But we forget how much good may be prevented and how much ill may be produced by the power of hindering the doing what may be necessary, and of keeping affairs in the same unfavorable posture in which they happen to stand at particular periods. Suppose, for instance, we were engaged in a war, in conjunction with one foreign nation against another. Suppose the necessity of our situation demanded peace, and the interest or ambition of our ally led him to seek the prosecution of the war, with views that might justify us in making separate terms. In such a state of things, this ally of ours would evidently find it much easier, by his bribes and intrigues, to tie up the hands of the government for making peace, where 2/3 of all the votes were requisite to that object, than where a simple majority would suffice. In the first case, he would have to corrupt the smaller number, in the last, a greater number. Upon the same principle, it would be much easier for a foreign power with which we were at war to perplex our counsels and embarrass our exertions. And, in a commercial view, we may be subjected to similar inconveniences. A nation with which we might have a treaty of commerce would be much greater facility, prevent our forming a connection with her competitor in trade, though such a connection should ever be so beneficial to ourselves. Evils of this description ought not to be regarded as imaginary. One of the weak sides of republics, among their numerous advantages, is that they afford too easy an inlet for foreign corruption. A hereditary monarch, though often disposed to sacrifice his subjects to his ambition, has so great a personal interest in the government and in the external glory of the nation, that it is not easy for a foreign power to give him an equivalent for what he would sacrifice by treachery to the state. The world has accordingly been witness to few examples of this species of royal prostitution, though there have been abundant specimens of every other kind. In republics, persons elevated from the mass of the community by the suffrages of their fellow citizens to stations of great preeminence and power may find compensations for betraying their trust, which, to any but minds animated and guided by superior virtue, may appear to exceed the proportion of interest that they have in common stock, and to overbalance the obligations of duty. Hence it is that history furnishes us with so many mortifying examples of prevalency of foreign corruption in republican governments. How much this constituted to the ruin of the ancient commonwealths has already been delineated. It is well known that the deputies of the United Provinces have, in various instances, been purchased by the emissaries of the neighboring kingdoms. The Earl of Chesterfield, if my memory serves me right, in a letter to his court, intimates that his success in an important negotiation must depend on his obtaining a major's commission for one of those deputies. And in Sweden, the parties were alternately bought by France and England in so barefaced and notorious a manner that it excited universal disgust in the nation,
and was a principal cause that the most limited monarch in Europe, in a single day, without tumult, violence, or opposition, became one of the most absolute and uncontrolled.
A circumstance which crowns the defects of the Confederation
Remains to be mentioned.
the want of a just judiciary power.
The laws are a dead letter without courts to expound and define their true meaning and operation. The treaties of the United States, to have any force at all, must be considered as part of the law of the land. Their true import, as far as respects individuals, must, like all other laws,
Be ascertained by judicial determinations. To produce uniformity in these determinations, they ought to be submitted, in the last resort, to one supreme tribunal, and this tribunal ought to be instituted
under the same authority which forms the treaties themselves.
These ingredients are both indispensable. If there is in each state a court of final jurisdiction, there may be as many different final determinations on the same point as there are courts. There are endless diversities in the opinions of men. We often see not only the different courts, but the judges of the court differing from each other. To avoid the confusion which would unavoidably result from the contradictory decisions of a number of independent judiciatories, all nations have found it necessary to establish one court, paramount to the rest, possessing a general superintendence and authorized to settle and declare the last resort a uniform rule of civil justice. This is the more necessary where the frame of government is so compounded that the laws of the whole are in danger of being contravened by the laws of the parts. In this case, if the particular tribunals were invested with a right of ultimate jurisdiction, besides the contraindications to be expected from difference of opinion, there will be much to fear from the bias of local views and prejudices, and from the interference of local regulations. As often as such an interference was to happen, there would be reason to apprehend that the provisions of the particular laws might be preferred to those of the general laws, for nothing is more natural to men in office than to look with particular deference towards that authority to which they owe their official existence. The treaties of the United States under the present Constitution are liable to the infractions of 13 different legislatures, and as many different courts of final jurisdiction acting under the authority of those legislatures. The faith, the reputation, the peace of the whole Union are thus continually at the mercy of the prejudices, the passions, and the interest of every member of which it is composed. Is it possible that foreign nations can either respect or confide in such a government? Is it possible that the people of America will no longer consent to trust their honor, their happiness, their safety on so precarious a foundation? In this review of the Confederation, I have confined myself to the exhibition of its most material defects, passing over those imperfections and its details by which even a greater part of the power intended to be conferred upon it has been, in great measure, rendered abortive. It must be by this time evident to all men of reflection who can divest themselves of the prepossessions of preconceived opinions that it is a system so radically vicious and unsound as to admit not of amendment but by an entire change in its leading features and characters. The organization of Congress is itself utterly improper for the exercise of those powers which are necessary to be deposited in the Union. A single assembly may be a proper receptacle of those slender, or rather fettered, authorities, which have been heretofore delegated to the federal head. But it would be inconsistent with all the principles of good government to entrust it with those additional powers which even the moderate and more rational adversaries of the proposed Constitution admit ought to reside in the United States. If that plan should not be adopted, and if the necessity of the Union should be able to withstand the ambitious aims of those men who may indulge magnificent schemes of personal aggrandizement from its dissolution, the probability would be that we should run into the project of conferring supplementary powers upon Congress, as they are now constituted, and neither the machine from the intrinsic feebleness of its structure, will molder into pieces in spite of our ill-judged efforts to prop it, or by successive augmentation of its force as an energy, as necessity might prompt, we shall finally accumulate in a single body all the most important prerogatives of sovereignty, and thus entail upon our posterity one of the most execrable forms of government that human infatuation ever contrived. Thus, we should create in reality that very tyranny which the adversaries of the new Constitution are, or effectively, solicitous to avert. It has not little contributed to the infirmities of the existing federal system that it never had a ratification by the people, resting on no better foundation than the consent of the several legislatures. It has been exposed to frequent and intricate questions concerning the validity of its powers, and has, in some instances, given birth to the enormous doctrine of a right of legislative appeal, owing its ratification to the laws of a state. It has been contended that the same authority might repeal the law by which it was ratified. However gross a heresy it may be to maintain that a party to a compact has a right to revoke that compact, the doctrine itself has had respectable advocates. The possibility of a question of this nature proves the necessity of laying the foundations of our national government deeper than in the mere sanction of delegated authority. The fabric of American empire ought to rest on the solid basis of the consent of the people. The streams of national power ought to flow immediately from that pure, original fountain of all legitimate authority. And so we end with Federalist number 22. And here we again get an argument about why we are better together, right? The tyranny of the majority is a problem. Our government is intended to run slow. That is literally the intention of the three branches, right? We have the executive branch, which is fast enough to act in times of emergency and invested with the powers that an emergency would entail. They have command of the armies, but not the power to declare war, right? They have the ability to respond, but not to commit to an act solely by themselves. That is invested in the legislative branch, and the legislative branch is made up of two Congresses, right? You have the House of Representatives and you have the Senate. The House of Representatives is meant to be quick. It is meant to reflect the will of the people and as fast as possible. Whereas the Senate is to slow down that process. The reason that you have to go through both houses before it can go to the executive is so that the fast will of the people is there, and the slow conservatory nature of the senators is also there, so that we don't jump into situations where we don't belong. We are, as of today, 5/1/24, rolling into a situation in which we do not belong. But it is not because of the acts of Congress. We have not had laws passed. We do not have an official declaration of war. We're just going. That's a problem. That is outside of the bounds of the Constitution. And so we have not been holding up our responsibility, our end of it. It is up to us, as the citizens, to be an informed electorate. If you are going to take the time to vote, it is up to you to be responsible to understand the vote and why you are voting for who you are voting for, not just because of a letter behind their name, but because of the actual things that they actually stand for. If your elected representatives do not stand for what you stand for, it is your responsibility to ensure that someone gets in there that does. It is your responsibility to get out and to campaign for someone who aligns with your values. It is your responsibility to ensure that the person who is running aligns with your values. We have a severe problem today with career politicians, and people want term limits. And while I understand that sentiment, it is a foolish one, because we do have good congresspeople. We do have good senators, and there is no problem with a good senator staying there for 20 years. Now, I think that maybe 30 is a little bit pushing it, right? And once you reach a certain point in your life, you probably should be removed, but that should be by the electorate. It shouldn't be by some arbitrary number decided by people. Well, if you're made 65, you can't do anything. Well, you could have 20 years of cognitive ability left, and now you have the wisdom to do things. I see a lot on TikTok about people talking about Gen X as being called up. And to a certain degree, I agree with that. We didn't jump into leadership. I'm Gen X. I'm the very end of Gen X. And we didn't jump into a leadership role because we had seen what jumping into a leadership role had done. The people before us, they didn't do a good job, right? They were out there in in the professional setting, not doing the professional things. They are not being held to account by their constituency. And that is our problem. Our problem is our responsibility as the electorate. We are supposed to hold these people accountable. And if they are not being held accountable, we are the problem. I am 100% against one of my representatives. I will not vote for him. I am emphatically insisting that we have somebody else to run in his place. And I'm talking to you, Bill Cassidy, you traitor to America. That's who I'm against, right? And it is my responsibility as an electorate to assure that in 2 years we have somebody able to run against him. Because if not, we will wind up with him again. And that is the problem. Us not taking responsibility. All right, back to 23. We're going to go ahead and read this one and wrap it up. So, the necessity of a government as energetic as the one proposed to the preservation of the Union. From the New York Packet, Tuesday, December 18th, 1787, by Alexander Hamilton, to the people of the state of New York. The necessity of a constitution, at least equally energetic with the one proposed to the preservation of the Union, is the point of the examination of which we are now arrived. This inquiry will naturally divide itself into three branches: the objects to be provided for by the federal government, the quantity of power necessary to the accomplishment of those objects, and the persons upon whom that power ought to operate. Its distribution and organization will more properly claim our attention under the succeeding head. The principal purposes to be answered by the Union are these common defenses of the members. The common defense of the members, the preservation of the public peace, as well as against internal convulsions as external attacks, the regulation of commerce with other nations and between the states, the superintendence of our intercourse, political and commercial, with foreign countries. The authorities essential to the common defense are these: to raise armies, to build and equip fleets, to prescribe rules for the government of both, to direct their operations, to provide for their support. These powers ought to exist without limitation, because it is impossible to foresee or define the extent and variety of national exigencies, or the correspondent extent and variety of the means which may be necessary to satisfy them. The circumstances that endanger the safety of nations are infinite, and for this reason no constitutional shackles can wisely be imposed on the power to which the care of it is committed. This power ought to be coextensive with all the possible combinations of such circumstances, and ought to be under the direction of the same councils which are appointed to preside over the common defense. This is one of those truths which, to be a correct and unprejudiced mind, carries its own evidence along with it, and may be obscured but cannot be made plainer by argument or reasoning. It rests upon axioms as simple as they are universal. The means ought to be proportioned to the end. The persons from whose agency the attainment of any end is expected ought to possess the means by which it is to be attained. Whether there ought to be a federal government entrusted with the care of the common defense is a question in the first instance, open for discussion, but the moment it is decided in the affirmative, it will follow that that government ought to be clothed with all the powers requisite to complete execution of its trust. And unless it can be shown that the circumstances which may affect the public safety are reducible within certain determinate limits, unless the contrary of this position can be fairly and rationally disputed, it must be admitted as a necessary consequence
that there can be no limitation on that authority, which is to provide for the defense and protection of the community in any matter essential to its efficiency, that is, in any matter essential to the formation, direction, or support of the national forces. Defective as the present Confederation has proven to be,
This principle appears to have been fully recognized by the framers of it, though they have not made proper or adequate provision for its exercise. Congress have an unlimited discretion to make requisitions of men and money, to govern the Army and Navy, to direct their operations. As their requisitions are made constitutionally binding upon the states, who are in fact under the most solemn obligations to furnish the supplies required of them. The intention, evidently, was that the United States should command whatever resources were by them judged requisite to the common defense and general welfare. It was presumed that a sense of their true interest and a regard to the dictates of good faith would be found sufficient pledges for the punctual performance of the duty of the members of the federal head. This experiment has, however, demonstrated that this expectation was ill-founded and illusory, and that observations made under the last head will, I imagine, have sufficed to convince the impartial and discerning that there is an absolute necessity for an entire change in the first principles of the system. That if we are in earnest about giving the Union energy and duration, we must abandon the vain project of legislating upon the states in their collective capacities. We must extend the laws of the federal government to the individual citizens of America. We must discard the fallacious scheme of quotas and requisitions as equally impracticable and unjust. The result from all this is that the Union ought to be invested with full power to levy troops, to build and equip fleets, and to raise the revenues which will be required for the formation and support of an army and navy, in the customary and ordinary modes practiced in other governments. If the circumstances of our country are such as to demand a compound instead of a simple, a confederate instead of a sole government, the essential point which will remain to be adjusted will be to discriminate the objects, as far as it can be done, which shall appertain to the different provinces or departments of power, allowing to each the most ample authority for fulfilling the objects committed to its charge. Shall the Union be constituted the guardian of the common safety? Are fleets and armies and revenues necessary to this purpose? The government of the Union must be empowered to pass all laws and to make all regulations which have relation to them. The same must be the case in respect to commerce and to every other matter to which the jurisdiction is permitted to extend. Is the administration of justice between the citizens of the same state the proper department of the local governments? These must possess all the authorities which are connected with this object, and with every other that may be allotted to their particular cognizance or direction, not to confer in each case a degree of power commensurate to the end, would be to violate the most obvious rules of prudence and propriety, and improvidently to trust the great interest of the nation to hands which are disabled from managing them with vigor and success. Who is likely to make suitable provisions for the public defense, as that body to which the guardianship of the public safety is confided, as the center of information, will best understand the extent and urgency of the dangers that threaten, as the representatives of the whole will feel itself most deeply interested in the preservation of every part, which, from the responsibility implied in the duty assigned to it, will be most sensibly impressed with the necessity of proper exertions, and which, by the extension of its authority throughout the states, can alone establish uniformity and concert in the plans and measures by which the common safety is to be secured. Is there not a manifest inconsistency in devolving upon the federal government the care of the general defense, and leaving in the state governments the effective powers by which it is to be provided for? Is not a want of cooperation the infallible consequence of such a system? And will not weakness, disorder, an undue distribution of the burdens and calamities of war, an unnecessary and intolerable increase of expense, be its natural and inevitable concomitants. Have we not had unequivocal experience of its effects in the course of the revolution which we have just accomplished? Every view we may take of the subject, as candid inquirers after truth, will serve to convince us that it is both unwise and dangerous to deny the federal government an unconfined authority as to all those objects which are entrusted to its management. It will indeed deserve the most vigilant and careful attention of the people to see that it be modeled in such a manner as to admit of its being safely vested with the requisite powers. If any plan which has been, or may be, offered to our consideration should not, upon a dispassionate inspection, be found to answer this description, it ought to be rejected. A government, the constitution of which renders it unfit to be trusted with all the powers of which a free people ought to delegate to any government, would be an unsafe and improper depository of the national interests. Wherever these can with propriety be confided, the coincident powers may safely accompany them. This is the true result of all just reasoning upon the subject, and the adversaries of the plan promulgated by the convention ought to have confined themselves to showing that the internal structure of the proposed government was such as to render it untrustworthy of the confidence of the people. They ought not to have wandered into the inflammatory declamations and unmeaning cavils about the extent of the powers. The powers are not too extensive for the objects of the federal administration, or, in other words, for the management of our national interests. Nor can any satisfactory argument be framed to show that they are chargeable with such an excess. If it be true, as has been insinuated by some of the writers on the other side, that the difficulty arises from the nature of the thing, and that the extent of the country will not permit us to form a government in which such ample powers can safely be reposed, it would prove that we ought to contract our views and resort to the expedient of separate confederacies, which will move within more practicable spheres. For the absurdity must continually stare us in the face of confiding to a government the direction of the most essential national interests without daring to trust it to the authorities, which are indispensable to their proper and efficient management. Let us not attempt to reconcile contradictions, but firmly embrace a rational alternative. I trust, however, that the impracticability of one general system cannot be shown. I am greatly mistaken if anything of weight has yet been advanced of this tendency, and I flatter myself that the observations which have been made in the course of these papers have served to place the reverse of that position in as clear a light as any matter still in the womb of time and experience can be susceptible of. This, at all events, must be evident, and that the very difficulty itself, drawn from the extent of the country, is the strongest argument in favor of an energetic government, for any other can certainly never preserve the union of so large an empire.
If we embrace the tenets of those who oppose the adoption of the proposed Constitution as the standard of our political creed, we cannot fail to verify the gloomy doctrines which predict the impracticability of a national system pervading the entire limits of the present Confederacy. Publius.
And so we end Federalist paper number 23, and this is where we're going to wrap up. And what we see here is an explanation of what I just said. We are responsible to ensure that the government justly enforces their powers. They have been endowed with powers, and rightly so. There are items of national defense and national import that are indeed better regulated by a national government. We have, through laziness, allowed the government to exceed those bounds. There are things already that have been discussed in these papers that we have allowed the government to exceed. The FDA is definitely one of those things, right? The regulation of trade And what is allowed to be trade in such a manner is in large part detrimental to us. It is because it should be up to the states whether or not you can buy raw milk. It should be up to the states whether or not you can buy organic foods. It should be up to the states on such a large level that we have given away. The education system should be states. It should be city-based, but states is where we're going to put it, right? We should strive as citizens to keep government restricted as much as possible. That is our duty as citizens, to not give away our authority as citizens. It is up to us to ensure that our elected representatives are actually representing us as elected. It is our responsibility as citizens to ensure that our taxes are paid and used in the manner in which we approve. I do not approve of most of what is being done with our tax money. But it ain't even our tax money. We are so far behind in debt that it's ridiculous. And that is a limitation of the federal power that we should, as an electorate, be putting into place. We should be electing financially responsible adults to be financially responsible for our country. We should have clear, even-tempered people who are in charge of our district. If your district is represented by somebody who is not intelligent, it is your responsibility to change that or move. Like, that's the freedom of our system. That's the point of our system. That is the beauty of our system, is that if you don't agree with New York, you can move to Massachusetts. And if you don't agree with the Northeast, you can move to the West. That is the beauty of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is that you get to choose which hills you die on. You get to choose where those hills are located. And you don't have to ask anybody. You get to do it. The government is restricted from restricting your rights. Your rights are not fully enumerated, but in part enumerated and guaranteed. They're not given to you by the government, but they are ensured in the writing of the Constitution that you have rights. That is not something that is anywhere else. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult topic. There is a reason why I'm doing this, right? This is an energetic investment into the future of our country. The understanding of these papers makes a lot of sense. It should be required reading. You should have to understand this and demonstrate that before you can graduate. Our civics are severely lacking in this country. And I believe that me reading this out loud and you hearing this is an energetic investment, that what you speak comes into being. And I firmly believe in our union. We are weak right now. There are several problems, but most of those problems come down to the fact that we have pissed away our responsibilities, right? We want our rights. We want all our rights. How dare you talk about my rights, but we don't want the responsibility, right? You have the right to bear arms, and you vote for people who want to put common sense gun laws into place. That is retarded. That makes no sense. That is stupid. You should not do that. The only way that any of your rights can be curtailed by the government is through the judicial process. And that I agree with. You lose your rights when you are a criminal, then you don't have rights. Now, once you have served your term, there should be a means to return your rights, right? But I don't want somebody convicted of murder being able to go out and buy a gun, and we already have that. If the laws are followed that we already have, then that already is a thing. The problem that we have are people willing to bypass the laws. That's a whole separate issue. That is us, again, failing as an electorate. That is us failing again to hold our fellow citizens responsible for being intelligent. Right? We have come to the point of ridiculing intelligence in this country. We're come to the point where if we don't turn around our education, we are going to be facing some severe problems. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me. I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you.
God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take.
Peace.